High Priestess Nyx Vora stood at the panoramic observation platform of the spire, her posture tense, arms folded in various disapproving gestures as she watched the primitive human vessel dock at the royal landing pad. Her scales, usually a calm blue, shifted to a deep, troubled purple, a reflection of her internal frustration at what she considered a humiliating choice for their species. Behind her, the members of the Australian High Council exchanged hushed murmurs, their collective unease manifesting in subtle shifts of color that rippled through the chamber. This situation, Nyx Vora realized, was truly dire for them to even consider a human physician as a potential savior for their ailing Queen Zalera. The ship, which could barely be called a vessel, landed clumsily on the pad, its rough landing evoking the image of an injured GTH beast. The insignia on the hull, a simplistic red cross, signified its medical purpose, looking painfully inadequate compared to the elegant, bioorganic design of Australian medical technology. Your Grace, Senior Counselor Riesel's voice was thick with barely concealed contempt as he approached. The human physician is preparing to disembark. Shall we send an honor guard to escort him? Nyx Vora let out a sound akin to a laugh, but it was sharp, laced with sarcasm. An honor guard for a human? Next, you'll suggest we scatter sacred petals at his feet. She turned to face Riesel, her 4 eyes narrowing with icy disdain. Send 2 security drones and a protocol unit. That should be sufficient for a creature of his status. Through the viewing screen, she watched as Dr. James Foster finally stepped out of the ship. He was utterly unremarkable, a typical human male with graying hair at the temples, wearing a standard white medical coat over his everyday clothes. This is who they send, she scoffed. When our queen lies gravely ill, the Australian Empire stretches across 47 star systems, and we possess technologies that these humans cannot even begin to comprehend. Their civilization barely manages faster than light travel, and yet here we are, depending on their help. Dr. Foster was now being scanned by the security drones, moving with careful deliberation. Nyx Vora begrudgingly noted that at least he showed proper respect for their protocols, unlike many humans she had encountered. Her contemplation was interrupted by a sudden burst of urgency. Your Grace, came the voice of Mira Lin, one of Queen Zalera's personal attendants. The Queen's vital signs are unstable again. The medical AI has detected another 2% drop in her bioluminescence. Nyx Vora's scales darkened to a vivid crimson, the color of intense concern. Take the human directly to the Queen's quarters. Skip the usual formalities, she said, though the words tasted bitter in her mouth. Grant him provisional Class 1 medical authority. The council members behind her gasped in unison, their shock almost palpable. Class 1 medical authority was the highest level of access, usually reserved for the most esteemed practitioners in their field. Granting it to a human was an unheard of step. Your Grace, Riesel began, about to protest, but she silenced him with a quick, decisive gesture from her lower left hand. I do not agree with this more than you do, Counselor, but Queen Zalera's condition has defied our most advanced medical technology for 3 full lunar cycles. We have no other choice. Our finest minds are baffled, High Priestess Nyx Vora stated, her voice carrying a heavy weight of frustration. Our healing chambers have failed. Even the ancient knowledge stored in the Great Archive has not yielded any answers. She turned her attention back to the viewing screen, observing as Dr. Foster was escorted into the spire. If we must temporarily lower ourselves to accept assistance from a human to save our queen, then that is what we shall do. Her posture straightened, her scales settling into the formal pattern of royal blue and gold. Let us make one thing clear, this is not a challenge to the natural order. The human may possess some basic insights that our healers have overlooked, but he is still what he is, a member of a barely civilized species playing with technologies that they scarcely understand. As she spoke those words, she had no way of foreseeing just how completely the events of the next few hours would shatter her carefully cultivated beliefs. Dr. Foster's footsteps reverberated through the bioluminescent halls of the medical wing, each step causing Royal Advisor Cax Thorne's facial ridges to twitch in irritation. The very atmosphere here was an affront to everything the Australian Empire stood for. Their medical facilities were the pinnacle of advancement in known space, with self-aware diagnostic chambers and nanomolecular reconstructors capable of rebuilding entire organ systems. As you can see, Cax Thorne gestured toward a wall of pulsating displays with his upper arms while his lower limbs adjusted his ceremonial robes. Our systems have already attempted every known treatment protocol. The Queen's condition remains stubbornly resistant. Dr. Foster's response came with a sharp exhale. The last word came out as nearly a hiss, he muttered, his eyes narrowing as he studied one of the diagnostic screens. These readings indicate some form of cascading cellular breakdown, but the pattern is unlike anything I've seen before. door. "Have you considered?" Cax Thorne began, but the human cut him off. "We've considered everything," the advisor interjected, his scales flashing an angry orange. "Our medical AIs have run over 10 million simulations. The Healing Senate has examined archives that span 12,000 years. We even attempted a consciousness transfer to a temporary host body, which has never failed us before." Dr. Foster, unfazed, pulled out a data tablet that seemed almost comically outdated in comparison to the sophisticated holographic displays around them. The screen looked laughably primitive. "And the consciousness transfer failed," Subhealer Vixren sneered from her position by the door. "Otherwise, we wouldn't have called for a human doctor." The scorn in her voice was palpable, especially as she uttered the word doctor. Dr. Foster seemed either unaware of or unconcerned with their hostile tone. He continued tapping notes into his tablet. "I'd like to examine the Queen directly." "Absolutely not." Cax Thorne's scales flared a deep crimson. "The protocols for approaching her luminance are extremely specific. There are purification rituals, ceremonial arrangements. We don't have time for that," came the firm voice of Nix Vora, entering the room with an air of authority that immediately commanded attention. "The Queen's bioluminescence has dropped another percentage point since we've been standing here debating." Cax Thorne moved to block the path to the Queen's chamber. "Your Grace, please." Allowing this human to make physical contact with her luminance violates every tradition, every sacred law. "Our traditions will mean little if we let our Queen die due to our own stubbornness," Nix Vora countered sharply, though her own scales betrayed her unease. The medical display panels suddenly flashed red, their harmonic warning tone sending a ripple of alarm through the room. The primary medical AI's voice filled the chamber. "Queen Zalera's neural patterns show signs of increasing entropy. Projected time to irreversible degradation. 4 standard hours." Dr. Foster stepped forward, his voice carrying a surprising authority, at odds with his simple appearance. "Your traditions are admirable and your technology impressive, but right now your Queen is dying. You can either stand on ceremony and watch it happen, or you can allow me to help." The room fell into an uneasy silence as the Australian Council members processed his words. Cax Thorne's scales cycled through an array of colors so quickly it became almost dizzying. Finally, High Priestess Nix Vora spoke. "The human speaks the truth, painful though it is for me to admit," she declared. Cax Thorne, step aside. "The sacred laws will be amended if necessary." She raised her hand to silence the counselor. "I invoke the clause of extreme need. By my authority as High Priestess, I grant Dr. Foster emergency dispensation to approach the Queen." The chamber erupted in a cacophony of gasps and protests. Cax Thorne appeared as though he might faint, his scales turning an unsettling shade of pale green. "Your Grace, in 12,000 years of recorded history, the clause of extreme need has only been invoked 3 times. Then let history record this as the 4th, Nix Vora declared firmly. She turned her attention to Dr. Foster, her 4 eyes locking onto him. "But understand this, human. If any harm comes to our Queen under your care, no force in this galaxy will shield you from our retribution." Dr. Foster met her gaze with unwavering steadiness. "I understand. Now, please, take me to your Queen." As they proceeded toward the Queen's chamber, Cax Thorne reluctantly fell into step behind them, his voice low and laced with bitterness. "When this human's primitive methods fail, Your Grace, I pray you remember who advised against this madness." None of them noticed that Dr. Foster had stopped paying attention to his tablet and was now intently observing the SLE patterns in the bioluminescent walls, patterns that the Australian species had long since tuned out as mere background noise. The Queen's chamber was a breathtaking example of bioorganic architecture, with walls that pulsed in rhythmic synchronicity with the Queen's weakening life signs. Queen Zalera lay upon a floating medical platform, her once vibrant scales now a sickly shade of gray. The sight of her halted even Dr. Foster, causing him to pause for a moment. "Our Queen hasn't moved in 3 days," Senior Healer Pax Nira's voice trembled as she spoke. "We've exhausted every treatment at our disposal. Neural stimulation, quantum realignment, even the forbidden arts of consciousness splitting." She gestured toward the array of advanced medical instruments surrounding the Queen. Dr. Foster withdrew his medical scanner, a device that seemed embarrassingly rudimentary compared to the sleek, sophisticated Australian equipment. Cax Thorne snorted in derision. "That primitive thing? Our diagnostic systems are 1,000 times more sensitive. Sometimes simpler is better," Dr. Foster replied calmly as he moved the scanner slowly over the Queen's body. "Our advanced systems might be overlooking something basic by digging too deeply." High Priestess Nix Vora watched the human closely, anxiety evident in the subtle shifts of her scales. "Our healers have been working tirelessly," Pax Nira continued, showing Dr. Foster a progression of the treatments they'd attempted. The senior healer waved her hand, and a holographic display materialized, revealing a complex web of medical procedures. We began with standard neural regeneration protocols. When those treatments failed, we tried quantum cellular reconstruction, followed by progressive consciousness transfer. Pax Nira's voice trailed off as Dr. Foster suddenly raised his hand, signaling for silence. "Stop," he said, his voice firm. "Go back to the neural readings from day one." Pax Nira blinked in confusion, her 4 eyes wide with uncertainty, but she complied. The hologram flickered, displaying earlier data. Dr. Foster moved closer to the Queen's floating platform, his expression sharp with focus. "What is the normal temperature range for Australian royalty?" he asked, his tone unusually calm but piercing. "Temperature," Cax Thorne scoffed, his voice laced with disbelief. "We're not dealing with a primitive biological malfunction. This is clearly a complex quantum neural degradation pattern." "Humor me," Dr. Foster insisted, his gaze never leaving the Queen. Pax Nira checked her readings and answered, "Normal body temperature for her luminance is between 32 and 34 degrees Celsius. Currently, she's at 33.2 degrees Celsius, well within the normal range." Dr. Foster nodded but didn't look satisfied. "And these bioluminescent patterns in the walls," he continued, gesturing around the room, "they're linked to her neural patterns, correct?" "Of course," Nix Vora replied, her tone dismissive. "All royal chambers are synchronized with their occupants. It's basic technology, hardly worth discussing." Before she could say more, the warning tone blared again, and the Queen's platform pulsed a deep red. "Critical alert," the medical AI's voice cut through the air. "Neural pattern degradation accelerating. Consciousness fragmentation imminent." Panic rippled through the room as the traditional healers rushed forward. Their hands moved in a choreographed, desperate attempt to stabilize the Queen, energy fields shimmering around her frail form. Despite their efforts, her vital signs continued to plummet. "Nothing's working," Pax Nira cried out in frustration. "The degradation pattern makes no sense." Dr. Foster acted quickly now, setting his scanner aside. He focused intently on the glowing patterns in the walls. "The bioluminescent patterns, they're not just displaying her neural patterns, are they?" He gestured around the room, his voice gaining strength with his realization. "They're trying to maintain them." A stunned silence followed, and all eyes shifted to him. Cax Thorne's scales flushed a deep purple in outrage. "That's preposterous. The synchronization is purely diagnostic, not therapeutic." Dr. Foster's expression remained unwavering. "No, he's right," whispered Pax Nira, her scales pale as understanding dawned on her. "The system was designed to support royal neural patterns. It's been trying to compensate for the degradation automatically." Dr. Foster nodded, his eyes never leaving the holographic display. "But that means," he paused, his voice calm but certain, "we've been looking at this backward. Your Queen isn't sick. She's too healthy. Her neural patterns are too strong for the system to handle. The room is overtaxing itself trying to sync with her enhanced neural activity. It's creating a feedback loop that's shutting down her consciousness." The room fell deathly silent as the full weight of his words sank in. The Australians stared at him, wide-eyed in disbelief. It was such a simple explanation, so simple that their advanced diagnostic systems had missed it entirely. But what could have caused her neural patterns to strengthen so suddenly? Nix Vora demanded, her voice strained. Dr. Foster turned to face her, his expression somber. "Has anything changed in the Queen's routine recently? Any new technologies installed? Changes to her diet?" Cax Thorne started to speak, but Pax Nira interrupted him. "The royal gardens. 3 weeks ago, we installed a new ornamental plant species from the Centa colonies. The Queen was quite taken with them. She spent hours in the garden after they were planted." Dr. Foster's eyes widened. "These plants?" he asked. "Were they properly tested for neural interaction?" A look of horror slowly spread across Pax Nira's face as the realization hit her. "They were tested for toxicity and genetic compatibility, but," Pax Nira began, her voice trailing off. "But not for psychic resonance," Dr. Foster finished, his gaze intense. "We assumed since they were purely decorative." Before she could respond, another warning tone filled the chamber, this time accompanied by a sharp tremor in the Queen's body. Her scales flickered weakly, signaling the increasing severity of her condition. "We're out of time," Dr. Foster said firmly. "I need to shut down the neural synchronization system." "Impossible," Cax Thorne erupted, his voice filled with disbelief. "Disconnecting a royal from their chamber synchronization has never been done. The shock alone could kill her." Dr. Foster's voice grew sharp and urgent. "She's dying anyway. Sometimes the most advanced solution is to simply turn everything off." He turned to face Nix Vora, his eyes locking on onto all four of hers. High Priestess, I need your authorization right now. The tension in Queen Zalera's chamber was palpable, the air thick with uncertainty. High Priestess Nyx Vora's scales flickered in a rain of conflicting emotions as she struggled with the weight of the human doctor's unprecedented request to sever the neural sync. Her voice wavered as she began. The system has been in place since before my grandmother's grandmother was born. Please, Dr. Foster urged, his gaze fixed on the Queen's deteriorating vital signs. Look at the pattern in the walls, really look at it. Your technology is trying so hard to help, but it's killing her. The bioluminescent walls had started pulsing faster, their once smooth rhythms now erratic and frantic. The medical AI's voice now carried an unmistakable note of strain. Warning, system capacity at 98%. Neural pattern degradation accelerating. Pax Nera, her professional curiosity now overcoming her traditional reservations, stepped closer to the walls. The resonance frequency is much higher than normal. If the human is right about the centiplants affecting her luminance's neural patterns, 2 minutes until critical system overload, the AI announced, its voice increasingly strained. Cax Thorn stepped forward, his scales almost white from stress. Your Grace, you cannot seriously be considering. Be silent, Nyx Vora commanded, her voice sharp, as all four of her eyes closed in concentration. When they opened again, her scales had shifted into a pattern of decisive gold. Dr. Foster, you have 1 minute to explain exactly what you plan to do. Dr. Foster took a deep breath and spoke quickly. Think of it like a power surge. Your Queen's enhanced neural activity is overwhelming the system. The system responds by trying to support her patterns, but the more it tries, the more strain it causes, which leads to more compensation. It's a vicious cycle. We need to break that cycle by turning everything off. Pax Nera's voice was full of dread as she asked, but the shock to her system, it will be less than what she's experiencing now, Dr. Foster insisted. Sometimes the most advanced solution is to simply pull the plug and let natural healing take over. Your Queen is strong. These enhanced neural patterns show she just needs a chance to stabilize without the system interfering. 1 minute until critical system overload, the AI warned, its tone growing desperate. Dr. Foster quickly pulled out his medical scanner again, but this time he aimed it at the walls. Look at these readings. Your bioorganic technology is incredible. It's evolving in real time, trying to keep up with her neural patterns, but it can't evolve fast enough. The strain is backfiring into her consciousness. Nyx Vora moved to the Queen's side, her eyes locked onto the weak flickering of the Queen's once brilliant scales. The silence that followed was filled with an oppressive weight of decision, the final moments before a choice that could either save or seal the Queen's fate. The human speaks the truth about one thing, she's dying anyway. Perhaps, High Priestess Nyx Vora straightened to her full height, her decision slowly taking form. Perhaps it's time to trust in our Queen's strength rather than our technology. Your Grace, Cax Thorn protested, his voice rising in alarm. The sacred protocols, 30 seconds to critical system overload. Override code, Nyx 7 Stellar 9, Nyx Vora commanded, her voice unwavering. Prepare for complete neural sync shutdown. Chaos erupted in the chamber. Traditional healers rushed to the Queen's side, their scales flashing in warning. Cax Thorn appeared as if he might collapse from the strain. Only Dr. Foster remained composed, his scanner steadily tracking the rapid changes in the wall patterns. 20 seconds to critical system overload, the AI warned, its voice now filled with tension. Nyx Vora turned to Dr. Foster, fixing him with all four of her eyes. If you are wrong about this, I know, he replied simply, his expression calm and focused. But right now, your Queen needs less help, not more. 10 seconds to critical system overload. Execute shutdown, Nyx Vora ordered, her voice firm despite the tremors in her scales. The impact was immediate and dramatic. The bioluminescent walls dimmed rapidly, their pulsing patterns fading into a dull glow. The intricate medical equipment surrounding the Queen powered down in a cascading wave of deactivating systems. For a moment, nothing happened. Queen Zalera lay motionless on the platform, her scales darker than before. Her neural patterns, Pax Nera whispered in disbelief, staring at her personal scanner. They're stabilizing. Dr. Foster nodded, a faint sense of satisfaction in his expression. Without the system trying to support her enhanced patterns, her natural neural resilience is taking over. The Centaur plants increased her neural capacity, but the chamber's support systems couldn't handle the upgrade. Sometimes the body knows best how to heal itself. Look, someone gasped. The queen's scales began to brighten, not with the artificial support of the chamber system, but with their own natural luminescence. A soft purple glow spread across her body, before shifting to a deep royal blue. Her consciousness patterns are reintegrating, Pax Nira announced, her voice filled with awe. It's like watching a star reform after a solar storm. Dr. Foster checked his readings one final time. Her neural patterns are strong and stable. I recommend keeping all systems offline for at least 48 hours to allow her to heal naturally. After that, you'll need to recalibrate the entire chamber to accommodate her enhanced neural capacity. Enhanced? Nyx Vora questioned, her voice filled with curiosity and uncertainty. Though the Centaur plants didn't harm her, they evolved her, Dr. Foster explained. Think of it as an unexpected upgrade. Your queen's neural capacity has essentially doubled. Once your systems are recalibrated to manage the increased load, she'll be stronger than ever. A soft moan from the platform drew everyone's attention. Welcome back, Your Luminance, Dr. Foster said quietly, his voice filled with respect. The queen's scales rippled weakly but with unmistakable royal authority when she spoke. Her voice, faint but clear, echoed through the chamber. You turned everything off? Yes, Your Luminance, Nyx Vora confirmed, moving swiftly to her side. The human doctor suggested it. Queen Zalera's gaze met Dr. Foster's, her voice a soft but resolute whisper. He was right, I could feel it. All the systems trying to help, pushing harder and harder until I couldn't think, couldn't maintain consciousness. Dr. Foster nodded gently, his tone steady. Sometimes the simplest solution is to let nature take its course. Queen Zalera's voice strengthened slightly. Your own strength was always enough. The technology was just getting in the way. The queen's scales flickered with what could only be described as amusement. How ironic that it took a human to remind us of that fundamental truth. Queen Zalera's initial recovery seemed promising, her scales brightening, but after 20 minutes, they began to dim once again. Dr. Foster furrowed his brow as he studied his readings, while the Australian medical staff hovered anxiously around him. Her neural patterns are still unstable, he announced, his voice tense as he observed the data. The shutdown helped, but she needs something to anchor her consciousness while her enhanced neural patterns fully integrate. Pax Nira hesitated before speaking. The quantum stabilizers? No more technology. Dr. Foster cut her off firmly, his voice resolute. She needs something simpler, more basic. He paused for a moment, then turned to High Priestess Nyx Vora, his expression serious. She needs physical contact. Human physical contact. The room went silent, the words hanging in the air like a blast of energy. Preposterous. Cax Thorn's scales turned nearly white with shock. No non-Azaran has ever touched a member of the royal family. The mere suggestion is what saved her life earlier, Dr. Foster interrupted, his tone sharp. Your people rely so heavily on technology that you've forgotten the healing power of simple touch. Human beings have known for millennia that physical contact can stabilize neural patterns, reduce stress, and promote healing, but touching? Nyx Vora's scales rippled with disbelief. Like some kind of primitive healing ritual? Exactly like that, Dr. Foster nodded, his expression calm. Sometimes the old ways are the best ways. The queen stirred on her platform, her scales flickering weakly in the dim light. Do it, she whispered. Your Luminance. Cax Thorn rushed forward, panic in his voice. You cannot be serious. The sacred laws? The sacred laws? Queen Zalera's voice grew stronger, filled with an undeniable authority. Were written by our ancestors, the same ancestors who must have known the value of physical contact, or why else would they build touch-sensitive scales into our very bodies? The room fell into a stunned silence. It was true. The Australian scales, which had once been exquisitely sensitive to touch, had become increasingly neglected as their technology advanced. The ritual of physical contact had all but vanished from their society. If you're sure, Your Luminance? Dr. Foster asked gently, his gaze meeting hers. I'm going to take your hand now. It might feel strange at first, but try to stay relaxed. The entire court seemed to hold its breath as Dr. Foster slowly reached toward Queen Zalera. Cax Thorn looked as though he might suffer an aneurysm. Pax Nira's scanner clattered to the floor in her shock. Even High Priestess Nyx Vora, ever composed, had her scales cycling through a kaleidoscope of colors so rapidly that they became a blur. The moment Dr. Foster's fingers made contact with Queen Zalera's hand, several things happened at once. A collective gasp echoed through the chamber. Someone screamed in surprise. Cax Thorn fainted, collapsing into the arms of two startled guards. But most importantly, the Queen's scales suddenly blazed with brilliant light. Remarkable. incredible, Pax Naira breathed, her voice awestruck as she scrambled to retrieve her scanner. Her neural patterns, they're using your bioelectric field as a temple. The simple electromagnetic signature of human touch is helping her consciousness reintegrate. Dr. Foster nodded, maintaining gentle contact with the Queen's hand, his expression filled with quiet satisfaction. Human touch has its own kind of technology, bioelectricity, micropressures, thermal transfer. We've just forgotten to notice it because it seems so simple. Queen Zalera's scales were now pulsing with strong, steady patterns of royal blue and gold. Her 6 eyes opened fully, and for the first time in days, she spoke with her full royal authority. How strange, she mused, that my ancestors built our entire civilization around the sensitivity of our scales, yet we gradually forgot their most basic purpose. Progress often means losing touch with our foundations, Dr. Foster replied, his tone thoughtful. Sometimes literally. To everyone's shock, the Queen laughed, a sound that made her scales sparkle like stars in the light. Indeed, Doctor, though I suspect this incident will spark quite a few changes in how we view progress. She turned her head to address the still stunned court. Let it be recorded that from this day forward, the laws regarding physical contact shall be reviewed and revised. We have hidden behind our technology for too long. High Priestess Nyx Vora stepped forward, her scales showing patterns of deep contemplation. Your Luminance, are you suggesting we should encourage more physical interaction? I am suggesting, the Queen replied firmly, that we should stop fearing it. Look at how our court reacted to simple touch, as if it were some kind of barbaric act. Yet here I am, healed by the very thing we scorned. Dr. Foster began to withdraw his hand, but the Queen gripped it firmly. Not yet, Doctor. I believe I need at least a few more minutes of this primitive healing technique. Her scales flickered with unmistakable amusement. For medical reasons, she added. Of course, Your Luminance, Dr. Foster replied with a slight grin, matching her tone. Far be it from me to argue with royal medical directives. Around them, the court was slowly recovering from their shock. Someone was fanning the still unconscious Cax Thorn, who had finally regained consciousness, though he was still visibly flustered. Pax Naira was furiously taking notes, likely already planning new research into bioelectric healing techniques. High Priestess Nyx Vora, standing quietly to the side, was watching the Queen with an expression that suggested she was deeply reevaluating everything she thought she knew about advancement and tradition. 1 week later, the Grand Spire observation deck buzzed with activity as the court gathered to bid farewell to Dr. Foster. Queen Zalera, her scales now glowing with unprecedented brilliance, stood at the center of attention. The medical records will show, Pax Naira announced to the assembled crowd, that her Luminance's neural capacity has indeed doubled. The Centaur plants, combined with the unconventional treatment method, have produced remarkable improvements in all aspects of her health. Unconventional, Queen Zalera's scales flickered with amusement. Come now, Pax Naira, you can say the word touch. See, the sky hasn't fallen. Nearby, Cax Thorn shifted uncomfortably, still sporting a small bandage where he'd hit his head during his fainting spell. Yes, well, perhaps some traditions were due for reconsideration. Speaking of reconsideration, the Queen continued, her voice commanding yet warm, I have signed the new Medical Integration Directive. Henceforth, all Australian healing centers will include a department dedicated to studying and implementing physical healing techniques. We will combine the best of both approaches, our advanced technology and these more natural methods. Progress need not always mean discarding the past. The room fell silent in awe as the Queen's words sank in. Her decision was not just a small shift in medical protocol. It was a profound shift in the way her people would view the balance between tradition and technology. The healing methods of the past were no longer to be ignored. Instead, they would be integrated with their advanced technologies, creating a new path for the future of the Australian Empire. High Priestess Nyx Vora, who had been quietly observing, stepped forward with a thoughtful expression. I must admit, Dr. Foster, you have challenged many of our most deeply held beliefs, and perhaps, her scales shifted to a humble blue-green. We are better for it. She paused, a hint of humor creeping into her voice. Though, I notice you still haven't shaken his hand. The Queen teased. Nyx Vora's scales flushed purple. One step at a time, Your Luminance. Actually, Dr. Foster interjected with a smile. The handshake was originally a human gesture to show we weren't carrying weapons. Given the Australian capacity for color-based emotional display, you might want to develop your own unique greeting, something that combines both culture strengths. A thoughtful suggestion, the Queen nodded. CX Thorn, please add that to the agenda for next week's Cultural Integration Committee. Assuming you can stay conscious through the entire meeting, the court erupted in laughter as CX Thorn's scales turned a mortified pink. I maintain maintain that I was merely overcome by the historical significance of the moment. Of course you were. Pax Naira patted his shoulder, causing him to jump slightly. We're all still adjusting to this new age of physical contact. Though I must say, my research into bioelectric healing patterns is yielding fascinating results. Just remember, Dr. Foster cautioned as he prepared to board his ship, technology and touch aren't enemies. They're tools in the same medical toolkit. The trick is knowing when to use each one. The wisdom we had forgotten, Queen Zalera acknowledged. She turned to address the court. Let this be remembered as the day when a human doctor taught the mighty Australian Empire that true advancement sometimes means returning to our roots. Speaking of returning, Nix Vora interjected, the Galactic Medical Conference has requested your presence next month. Doctor, apparently, several other species are interested in exploring these primitive healing techniques. Primitive? The Queen raised all 6 eyebrows. Careful, High Priestess. Your old prejudices are showing. My apologies. Nix Vora's scales shifted to an embarrassed orange. I meant to say these fundamentally essential and historically validated therapeutic methodologies. Much better, the Queen laughed, though perhaps a bit wordy for the conference brochures. As Dr. Foster's ship prepared for departure, Queen Zalera stepped forward and, to everyone's continued shock, extended her hand. Until next time, Dr. Foster. And thank you for reminding us that sometimes the most revolutionary act is to simply reach out and touch someone. The human doctor shook her hand firmly, smiling as the court managed not to faint this time. It's been an honor, Your Luminance. Though I do have one final prescription. Oh, those centauri plants in your garden. Maybe put up a warning sign. The Queen's scales sparkled with mirth. Already done, though I'm keeping them. Sometimes, it seems a little neural evolution is exactly what we need. As Dr. Foster's ship lifted off, CX Thorne was overheard muttering to Pax Naira, I still say we should have at least run a quantum analysis on that handshake. Oh, be quiet, Pax Naira replied, and to everyone's surprise, gave him a friendly poke with one of her lower arms. Or do I need to prescribe some primitive therapeutic contact? The sound of royal laughter echoed through the spire as CX Thorne's scales turned bright pink once again.